Ida for not helping my dad's wife because I'm pissed about the trouble she brought into our lives? My dad got married 5 years ago, and in those 5 years, my life unraveled in ways I never imagined possible. I was only 12 when it happened, just starting to find my footing after losing my mom, and the sudden chaos that followed my dad's decision to remarry was like a whirlwind that refused to settle. He married a woman who came with more baggage than anyone could ever be prepared for: 3 kids, a bitter ex-husband, and a web of unresolved drama that seemed to seep into every corner of our lives. Her ex was a force of destruction, a shadow that loomed over our home and lives like a storm cloud. He smashed our downstairs windows in a fit of rage, not that we could prove it was him, though it felt obvious. He wasn't content to let his anger simmer in private, he made sure it spilled out into our world in every way he could. He attacked my dad once, landing himself 6 months in jail for the assault, but even that didn't stop him. He would sit outside our house for hours, as if his mere presence could poison the air. He hurled threats and insults, his voice dripping with venom, as if his words alone could crush us. He targeted me too, just a kid stuck in the middle of a nightmare, and hurled insults that left scars I couldn't see but felt deep inside. The police became a regular fixture in our lives, their flashing lights a grim reminder of how far things had spiraled. For a while, our house felt less like a home and more like a prison. I couldn't bring friends over, not with the risk of them witnessing the madness or, worse, becoming targets themselves. I couldn't leave the house unless my dad was with me, and even then, it felt like we were under constant surveillance. The idea of visiting my mom's grave, a place that had once brought me peace, became impossible. The fear that he might follow, might desecrate that sacred space with his rage, was too great. It wasn't just me who felt the weight of this chaos. My dad's new wife had 3 kids of her own, 7, 9, and 10 years old, and they were caught in the crossfire too. There were times when her ex's outbursts were so intense, so terrifying, that the kids would cry for him, desperate for the comfort of their dad. But their mom, my dad's wife, wouldn't allow it. She was determined to keep them away from him, to shield them from his toxic presence. And so, I was often the one tasked with comforting them, doing my best to reassure them while grappling with my own fear and resentment. It was an impossible situation. I wasn't their brother, but I was expected to step into that role, to put aside my own pain and anger for their sake. The days when her kids were with their dad were the only times the house felt remotely normal. It was quieter, less tense, and I could almost pretend that things were okay. But those moments of reprieve never lasted. My dad's wife was fighting for full custody, and with every legal battle, the tension escalated. Her ex became more unhinged, his actions more erratic and destructive. He was a storm that refused to pass, and we were stuck weathering it, powerless to stop it. My dad, in his desperation to protect us, pulled me from every extracurricular activity I was involved in. I couldn't play soccer or join the school's art club anymore. He thought he was keeping me safe, but all I felt was the loss of the few things that had brought me joy and escape. The resentment I felt was like a weight in my chest, growing heavier with every passing day. I resented my dad for bringing this chaos into our lives, for choosing this woman and her baggage over the peace we'd had before. I resented his wife for not warning us, for not considering the impact her ex would have on me, on my life. I knew she was a victim too, but that didn't erase the bitterness I felt. Her ex's actions might not have been her fault, but the consequences of her choices were something we all had to live with. It felt selfish, the way she had brought her mess into our lives and expected us to adapt, to endure. I couldn't see the family my dad claimed we were building. All I could see was the wreckage. And as much as I wanted to believe things would get better, a part of me knew that the damage had already been done. The life I'd had before my dad's marriage was gone, and no amount of pretending could bring it back. The legal battles dragged on, and with each court hearing, the air around us grew thicker with tension. It was as if the universe had conspired to keep us trapped in this endless cycle of turmoil, where every small step forward was met with 2 crushing steps back. Lawyers were constantly coming in and out of our lives, talking in a language I didn't fully understand but could feel the weight of in my chest. My dad's wife was determined to secure primary custody of her kids, which only seemed to stoke the fire of her ex's rage. He turned into a specter that haunted our lives, always lurking just out of reach, his presence a constant reminder that peace was nothing more than a fleeting illusion. The stalking didn't stop. If anything, it became more brazen. He'd show up outside our house, sometimes parked in his car for hours, other times pacing back and forth on the sidewalk as though he were daring someone to confront him. On occasion, I'd catch glimpses of him when I walked past the windows, his silhouette illuminated by the streetlights, and my stomach would churn with a mix of fear and anger. He was always there, like some dark omen that wouldn't go away. The police came often, but it felt like they were powerless to actually help us. They'd take statements, file reports, and advise us to stay vigilant, but nothing ever came of it. Each time they left, we were left with the same feeling of helplessness, like we were just sitting ducks, waiting for his next move. The worst part was knowing that even with the cameras we'd installed, he always managed to evade identification. The footage was grainy and inconclusive, the shadows and angles conspiring to shield him from accountability. It was infuriating. How could someone cause so much destruction and still walk away unscathed? And destruction was a constant in those days. Broken windows, slashed tires, shattered flower pots. No matter what precautions we took, it was like he always found a way to hurt us. My dad tried to shield me from the worst of it, but there was no escaping it. It was my reality, too. I was the one who had to help clean up the glass, sweep up the debris, and pretend like it didn't bother me when inside I was screaming. I resented my dad for putting me in this situation, for dragging me into someone else's chaos. He was my dad, my protector, and yet it felt like he had chosen her over me, chosen her drama over my safety. His wife didn't make things any easier. She would go on about how grateful she was to have found a better family, as though we were some kind of rescue mission for her and her kids. She acted like we were this perfect, blended unit, ignoring the cracks that were splitting us apart. I couldn't stand it. How could she be so blind to the damage her presence had caused? How could she sit there and act like everything was fine when my life had been turned upside down because of her? It felt selfish, like she had made this choice without any regard for how it would affect the rest of us. And yet, she expected me to just fall in line, to accept her and her kids as part of my life without question. The resentment I felt wasn't just toward her, it was toward the whole situation. I hated that my dad had pulled me from all my extracurriculars in the name of safety. Soccer, art club, even just hanging out with friends after school, all of it was taken away. He thought he was protecting me, but all it did was make me feel more isolated, more trapped. I was a teenager, stuck in a world that felt like it was closing in on me, with no outlet for the frustration and anger that kept building inside. I couldn't even talk to my friends about it because, honestly, how do you explain something like this to someone who hasn't lived it? When the court finally ruled in favor of my dad's wife, granting her primary custody of her kids, I thought things might settle down. Maybe her ex would back off now that the legal battle was over. Maybe we could finally start to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. But I couldn't have been more wrong. If anything, things got worse. Her ex's anger seemed to reach a boiling point, and the incidents of vandalism and harassment escalated. It was like he couldn't handle the idea of losing, so he lashed out in the only way he knew how, by making our lives a living hell. There was one night that still sticks with me, one of the many nights I couldn't sleep because I was too on edge, too afraid of what might happen next. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a loud crash outside. My heart jumped into my throat as I sat up, my body frozen with fear. My dad was already running down the hallway, shouting for me to stay in my room, but I couldn't. I had to see what was happening. I crept to the window and peeked out, my breath catching as I saw the shards of glass glittering on the driveway, the shattered remains of one of our car windows. And there he was, her ex, standing in the street with a crowbar in hand, his face twisted with rage. He didn't even try to hide. He just stood there, staring up at the house like he was daring us to come out. The police were called, of course, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. Another report was filed, another sleepless night added to the growing list. It felt endless, like we were stuck in this nightmare with no way out. And through it all, my dad and his wife tried to act like everything was fine, like we could just keep going about our lives as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't pretend like this was normal, like this was okay. I felt like a stranger in my own home, like an outsider in my own family. My dad's wife tried to include me in their little blended family moments, but it just felt forced, like she was trying too hard to make something happen that wasn't there. I didn't want to be part of their family. I wanted my old life back, the life I had before she came along and brought all this chaos with her. I knew it wasn't fair to blame her entirely. She wasn't the one smashing windows or stalking us, but it was hard not to resent her for being the catalyst, for being the reason any of this was happening in the first place. As time went on, I started to feel like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. The fear, the anger, the resentment, it was all too much. I tried to find small moments of escape, whether it was losing myself in a book or zoning out with music, but even those moments were fleeting. The reality of my situation was always there, waiting to pull me back in. It was exhausting, living in a constant state of tension, always waiting for the next incident, the next blow. And through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that my dad had chosen this life for us, that he had chosen her and her drama over my safety and my happiness. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to get past it. I wanted to forgive him, to believe that he had made the best choice he could under the circumstances, but every time I looked at the shattered windows or the security footage that never showed enough, I was reminded of just how much we had lost. The truth was, I didn't see us as a family. I saw us as a collection of broken pieces, held together by nothing more than the hope that things might someday get better. But that hope was hard to hold on to when it felt like we were living in the eye of a storm, with no end in sight. And as much as I wanted to believe that things could change, a part of me knew that some scars run too deep to ever fully heal. Over the years, things did improve, if only slightly. The destruction, the stalking, the constant threat of violence all eased up, but the scars they left behind lingered like ghosts in our lives. My dad's wife got her primary custody, her ex settled into his every other weekend arrangement, and the chaotic whirlwind that had been our normal slowly began to quiet. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was more like the aftermath of a storm, where the air is thick with the smell of rain and the debris still litters the ground. The damage was done, and no amount of pretending could undo it. My dad and his wife seemed determined to act like we were the picture of a happy, blended family. They put on this facade of harmony and togetherness that felt like a slap in the face every time I saw it. It wasn't real, not to me. I didn't see a family when I looked at us. I saw a patchwork of broken pieces that didn't fit together, no matter how hard they tried to make it seem otherwise. My dad's wife smiled too much, like she thought her forced cheerfulness could erase everything we'd been through. She'd talk about how great it was to finally have stability, to have a better family for her kids, as if that stability hadn't come at the expense of my sanity and safety. I couldn't stand her. I tried to be polite, to keep my resentment buried, but it simmered under the surface, threatening to boil over with every fake smile and every forced family dinner. I wished my dad had never met her. I wished he had seen the chaos she brought with her and walked away. But he didn't. He stayed, and he dragged me into the mess with him. And now I was counting down the days until I turned 18, when I could finally leave it all behind. No more dealing with her ex's toxic shadow. No more pretending we were a family. No more suffocating under the weight of a life I never wanted. In the meantime, I found small ways to carve out pieces of independence. I got a job, which was one of the few things that felt like it was mine. It wasn't much, just a part-time gig, but it gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The restrictions were still there, though, lingering like chains I couldn't fully shake. I couldn't work late shifts because of the precautions we still had to take. My dad was adamant about that, and as much as I hated it, I understood. The threat of her ex might have faded, but it wasn't gone completely. We couldn't afford to be careless. My dad knew how I felt about all of it, about him, about his wife, about the life we were living. I didn't have to spell it out for him. He could see it in the way I avoided her, in the way I kept my distance during their attempts at family bonding. He never pushed me to talk about it, but I could feel his disappointment, like a heavy weight hanging in the air between us. He wanted me to accept her, to see what he saw in her, but I couldn't. She was the reason everything had fallen apart, and no amount of pretending could change that. She, on the other hand, was oblivious, or maybe she just refused to see it. She truly believed we were a real family, that her kids were my siblings, that we were all one big, happy unit. It was almost laughable, the way she clung to that illusion. But it wasn't funny. It was exhausting. Last weekend, she asked me to rearrange my work schedule to help her with an errand. She wanted to pick up some DIY supplies and thought I'd enjoy helping her since I liked DIY projects. I could feel the tension building the moment she asked. It wasn't just the request, it was the assumption behind it, the expectation that I'd drop everything to help her like I owed her something. I told her no. Plain and simple. I wasn't interested, and I wasn't going to do it. She didn't take it well. She pressed me, asking why I wouldn't help her, as if she genuinely couldn't understand why I'd refuse. And that's when it all came out. I told her the truth, or at least part of it. I told her she brought nothing but trouble into my life, that I didn't want to help her because I didn't want to be part of her mess. I didn't sugarcoat it, didn't try to soften the blow. She needed to hear it, even if it hurt. She took it hard, just like I knew she would. Her face fell, her forced cheerfulness crumbling in an instant, and she left the room without another word. Later, my dad confronted me about it. He didn't yell or lecture me, but the disappointment in his voice was worse than anything he could have said. He told me he was upset that I resented them finding each other, that I couldn't see the value in the life they'd built together. He said he thought our new family was worth it, that he'd hoped I'd feel the same way someday. I didn't hold back. I told him I didn't agree, that I didn't see it as worth it at all. I told him he wasn't blameless in any of this, that he had made choices that put me in harm's way, that uprooted my life and left me to deal with the fallout. He didn't argue, but the look on his face said everything. He was hurt, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I'd spent years bottling up my resentment, pretending I was okay when I wasn't, and I wasn't going to keep pretending for his sake. The tension in the house has been thicker than ever since that conversation. My dad and his wife are walking on eggshells around me, their attempts at normalcy feeling more forced than ever. I've been keeping my distance, focusing on my job and counting down the days until I can leave this all behind. But the thing is, even with an end in sight, the weight of it all hasn't lessened. The resentment, the anger, the sense of betrayal, it's all still there, festering like an open wound that refuses to heal. And as much as I want to believe that things will get better once I turn 18, a part of me knows that some scars don't fade, no matter how far you run. The weeks following that conversation felt like a cold war at home. My dad avoided talking to me unless he had to, and when he did, there was a stiffness in his voice, a quiet sadness that made it clear he hadn't let go of what I'd said. His wife kept her distance too, though she would occasionally glance at me with this wounded look, like she couldn't comprehend how I could still be so cold after all this time. It wasn't that I enjoyed hurting them, at least not intentionally, but I couldn't pretend to feel something I didn't. And if I was being honest, part of me was tired of trying to tiptoe around their feelings when mine had been ignored for years. Despite the tension, life went on. I kept working, counting down the days until my 18th birthday, the day when I'd finally be free to make my own decisions without feeling trapped by the aftermath of their choices. But even as I focused on my escape plan, a nagging thought crept into my mind. What would that freedom even look like? I imagined moving out, finding a place of my own, and never having to deal with the suffocating weight of their so-called family again. But then what? The thought of being alone, truly alone, was both exhilarating and terrifying. As the days turned into weeks, I started to notice cracks in their carefully constructed facade. My dad and his wife didn't argue often, but when they did, their voices carried through the thin walls of the house. It was always about her ex, how to handle him, how to protect the kids, how to keep the rest of us safe. It became clear to me that even though things had gotten quieter, the storm hadn't passed. It was just lurking in the background, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. And while my dad's wife seemed determined to hold everything together, the strain was showing. Her cheerful demeanor felt more forced than ever, and the kids, though oblivious to the specifics, seemed to sense the tension too. One night, I overheard my dad talking to her in the kitchen. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that I hadn't heard before. "I just don't know if it was worth it," he said, and those words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I felt vindicated, like he was finally seeing things from my perspective. But then I realized he wasn't just talking about me. He was talking about everything, about the life they'd built together, about the years of chaos and struggle. For the first time, I saw my dad not as the strong, unwavering figure I'd always known, but as a man who was exhausted, who was questioning whether he'd made the right choices. That realization should have made me feel something: pity, understanding, maybe even compassion. But all I felt was emptiness. I didn't have it in me to comfort him, not after everything I'd been through. He made his choices, and now he had to live with them, just like I'd had to live with the consequences. As my 18th birthday approached, I started to put my plan into motion. I saved every spare penny I could, scoured online listings for affordable places to rent, and even lined up a second part-time job to help cover expenses. I didn't tell my dad or his wife what I was planning, partly because I didn't want to deal with the inevitable fallout, but also because a small, petty part of me wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted them to realize how serious I was, how determined I was to leave their perfect family behind. The day finally came, and with it, a mix of emotions I hadn't expected. I thought I'd feel triumphant, like I was finally reclaiming my life after years of being trapped in theirs. But as I packed up my things and loaded them into my car, I felt a pang of something that I couldn't quite name. Regret? Sadness? Guilt? Maybe it was all of those things, or maybe it was just the weight of closing a chapter that, for better or worse, had shaped me into the person I was. My dad tried to talk me out of it, of course. He asked me where I was going, how I planned to support myself, whether I'd thought this through. I could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear that he was losing me for good. But I didn't waver. I told him I'd made my decision, that this was something I needed to do for myself. He didn't argue, but the hurt in his expression was enough to make my resolve falter, if only for a moment. His wife didn't say much. She stood in the doorway, watching silently as I packed the last of my things. Her kids were with their dad that weekend, which made leaving a little easier. I didn't have to face their confused stares or their questions about why I was leaving. But as I turned to go, she finally spoke. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said softly, and for a brief moment, I almost believed she meant it. Life on my own was both liberating and challenging. The freedom was everything I'd hoped it would be. I could work late shifts, hang out with friends, and finally visit my mom's grave without looking over my shoulder. But the loneliness was harder to deal with than I'd expected. For all the resentment I'd felt toward my dad and his wife, they had been a constant in my life, and now that they were gone, there was an emptiness I didn't know how to fill. Months passed, and I started to settle into my new routine. I kept busy with work, saved up for school, and slowly began to rebuild the parts of my life that had been lost in the chaos. But no matter how much distance I put between myself and them, the past still lingered. I found myself replaying conversations in my head, questioning whether I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving. I thought about my dad's wife, about the way she'd looked at me that day, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd judged her too harshly. She wasn't blameless, but she wasn't the villain I'd made her out to be either. She was just a woman trying to protect her kids, trying to build a life in the midst of a storm she hadn't created. Eventually, I decided to reach out to my dad. It wasn't an easy decision, and it took me weeks to work up the courage to call him. When he answered, there was a hesitation in his voice, like he wasn't sure what to expect. But as we talked, I could feel some of the tension between us start to fade. We didn't hash out all our issues or dive into the pain of the past, but it was a tentative step toward something resembling forgiveness. Over time, I even began to mend my relationship with his wife. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but little by little, we found common ground. She never apologized outright, and I never expected her to. But there was an unspoken understanding between us, a mutual acknowledgement of the pain we'd both endured. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was enough. Looking back, I'm not sure if I'd call it a happy ending. The scars of those years will always be with me, a reminder of the chaos and pain that defined my adolescence. But I've learned that healing doesn't always mean erasing the past. Sometimes it's about finding a way to move forward, to build something new from the pieces that are left. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally moving forward.